Cool. Thank you very much. It's a weirdly kind of unnerving experience, sat at the back, watching Tim before you, speaking in German, which I don't understand, but talking about all the stuff I'm going to present about. So there's this real sense of kind of, I don't know which bits have kind of been, like maybe he was just disagreeing with everything I'm about to say, but I have no idea. So I'm going to go ahead as if he was entirely positive about what I'm going to talk about, and we'll see how that goes. So yeah, as just said, I'm Oliver Feldwick, head of the And-Partnership, head of innovation at the And-Partnership, and part of that role, it's kind of comes from a planning background. But what I try and look at is how do we make use of technology to make us more creative. So as a creative agency, as someone working in the creative industries, how should technology help us be better at what we do? And for me, it struck me as interesting that this seems to be like the common narrative in a lot around sort of AI is that robots are stealing our jobs. It's Terminator, it's the end, it's us versus them. But actually, technology's been one of the driving forces behind, jobs and the way we work for hundreds of years. Industrialization comes along and transforms how we work. And, it brings along a lot of disruption. It brings along a lot of good, a lot of bad. But, on the one hand, sure, robots could be stealing our jobs. But on the other hand, they've got to be the ones that can save us. And so I took this Terminator analogy and tortured it, see how far I could go with the analogy. But this idea that actually, for us to really survive in the current landscape, we've got to, rather than being scared of technology, we've got to face into it and figure out how it can help us be better versions of ourselves and how it can make us really survive. And for me, working in sort of advertising, the thing I was sort of looking at is I called it the creativity gap of we always seem to be facing this kind of impossible brief. So technology means we can be doing more things in more places at any one time, but the underlying human resource that's making that creativity can't keep up. And so I sort of think, part of the tension we sometimes feel as an industry right now is that the demands, the number of assets, the number of formats, the number of channels, the number of things we could be doing has gone up, and our ability to create stuff to go in there hasn't kept up. So our age of anxiety is in great part the result of trying to do today's job with yesterday's tools. And so I wanted to kind of flip that narrative around technology from sort of dystopian into something utopian, of kind of going, actually, if we work with technology in the right way, it should be something that could be a force for good and really change the way that we work. And I think there are lots of reasons to be optimistic. I think, if we use technology in the right way across whatever industry you're doing, but with a particular mindset on the creative industries, the human and machine together, sure, we could become super workers, where instead of, you being one person working on 3 or 4 projects, you're one person plus machine working on 10 projects brilliantly. But it can also mean, we free up time from the drudgery work to focus on the biggest creative opportunities. Perhaps by automating the easy, we can work harder on the difficult stuff and become better creative thinkers. Maybe we can all, if we liberate loads of time, if we automate lots of easy, simple, automatable tasks, we can spend that time learning other skills. We can learn how to play the flute. We can write poetry. We can become polymaths. We can do all sorts of new things. Maybe it's key to the new work-life balance, this idea that actually the amount of effort and work that we feel we have to put in the creative industries of the 40, 50, 60, 70-hour weeks of going, well, actually, if we can automate some of that away, we could also just enjoy a better work-life balance. But this is only possible if we really recognize the complementary roles of sort of humans and machines. And what's really lucky is that the things that we're good at is not the things that computers are good at, not the things that AI is good at. And I've sort of talked through a little bit of how that plays out and how you can kind of find really good complementary roles. And I think from what tiny bits I got through my incredible lack of German and ability to read the slides from Tim's talk, is again, it's that thing of finding what each of you is good at and not trying to make a computer that does the stuff that humans are good at, but trying to figure out how humans and computers can complement each other. We've kind of seen an interesting parallel, and I don't know if anyone here sort of is enthusiastic followers of chess, But if you read, so Gary Kasparov recently did a book called Deep Thinking, which was all about that evolution, where actually what's happening to us now happened to him in the 80s. He was at the forefront of being beaten and replaced by computers, where very visibly on an international stage was thoroughly beaten by a supercomputer playing chess, which then led to quite a lot of soul searching and existential angst of if you go from spending 20, 30 years to become a grandmaster, the best in your field, and then the next day a computer can do it better than you ever can, it's very hard to go, well, what's actually my purpose? What's my meaning in life? And what he's done since then, and I think there's an interesting parallel for us, is he's really got interested in understanding how machines think, and he's invented a new discipline called centaur chess, which is a human and an AI playing together who can beat even the best AIs alone these days. So now there's a kind of new paradigm in chess where you play centaur chess and it's you plus the machine working together against another team, so centaur teams versus centaur teams. And I think we can do a similar thing in creativity, where we kind of figure out how to retool our agencies and retool our thinking to become creative cyborgs. And I'll talk through a couple of ways that I think this can play out. And I basically, I put it into a grid because, strategy, planning, put things in a 2x2 grid. I think at the sort of the lower end, there's the sort of the automate the easy. This is, and I do think anything that, it's not a learning opportunity, it's not a valuable experience. If you can automate it, why wouldn't you? If it's a cheaper, better way to do something, there's nothing inherently valuable about doing it by hand. And so I think there's a real interesting of kind of what are the mundane tasks we can automate to free up time. Then I think, and there's kind of the augmented ability, which is a bit more, they're custom tools designed to help us with a specific part of the process, and that's to help humans get to a creative answer hand in hand with the right tools. And so there's sort of assisted craft at scale. So there are things that AI and machine learning allow us to do on a whole new scale, which is really interesting. And then there's also depth of insight. Some of the undeniable strengths of AI and machine learning is the ability to work with huge data sets, spot patterns, and sift through the data in a way that you don't want an army of data scientists to be wasting their time doing, but a computer can do it, and that's brilliant. And then I'll talk a little bit about higher order cyborg creativity, which is actually where human and machine can spark off each other and make each other better, and kind of reach this new higher order way of thinking and creating. And I think that's where it gets kind of interesting, but a little bit potentially more far-reaching. So in the kind of automating simple tasks, I think there are lots of, those simple little things that you could imagine quite easily designing bespoke sort of tools. It's a bit like the old sort of Microsoft Office paperclip, but actually works better, where it goes, it looks like you're writing a competitive review, perhaps I can help. The little bots that can just help automate sort of a lot of the simple reporting, a lot of diary management, a lot of spell checking and copywriting that actually isn't a creative opportunity. It's stuff that gets in the way of you doing the things that matter the most. But beyond that, I think there are some really interesting trends in kind of assisted craft at scale. So in the copywriting bot, so OpenAI recently sort of developed a copywriting bot that they then didn't want to really release to the public because they said it was too dangerous as a potential tool for fake news at scale. But so the one on the so there are two articles. You probably can't read either of them very well, but one of them is written by a machine, one's written by a human, and the Washington Post is increasingly using copywriting bots to write sort of short-term financial, sports, and politics reporting, where it's churning out hundreds of little articles to keep up with who won which game in which small college football game, and it can do it in a way that you can't tell the difference between the human and the machine. And I think there's an interesting question there of going, if you can get a machine that writes, short journalistic copy better than a human, why wouldn't you do it? And in an ideal world, that means that at the Washington Post, you can go off and do proper investigative journalism because you're not writing lots of short bit part pieces of copy. And you see again, so there was this sort of Nutella example where they just used algorithmic design to produce 1 million different designs for jars of Nutella. It's not rocket science, but it's the sort of thing that you wouldn't want to do manually. But also what Netflix does is really interesting, is it just uses tools that kind of go through the hours and hours and hours of content on the platform, and it can identify the key scenes with the key actors, making the right facial expressions, and then identify and clip together its own assets. So the little thumbnail pictures you get on Netflix, they're not chosen by human, which would be a sort of exhausting, boring task. They're chosen by a machine. And then they can also then personalize it. So if you're into rom-coms, they'll pick the scene with the lead sort of love interest. If you're into action, it'll pick a key action scene. And so it can let you do things like personalization. It can help you be able to do all of those sorts of things. And then you get into some interesting stuff around, machine learning's ability to tag and analyze content, essentially. Anything that's produced, it can go through, it can look at any scene of a film, any scene of some footage, and notice trends and themes. So I like this idea that, that in advertising you could look at all of your agency outputs and you could see what themes are there and join that up to an effectiveness database and go, okay, interestingly, when this thing features in our ads, we actually see this, this output. And you can start to join the dots and again do a level of analysis that wouldn't be possible in sort of traditional methods. And again, you start to see that, and again, with earlier, so things like Brainjuicer were an early kind of pioneer of this, but sort of natural language processing, facial recognition, facial coding, all of these things give us interesting new tools that we can actually be empowered to make decisions better thanks to the information we can get. So I think those are the sort of three layers where you go, those are interesting tools that are helping us do our jobs better, and it's just good technology to help us be better at our jobs. The bit where I get kind of excited is in the sort of what I call higher order creativity. And this is so they've used it in designing the atrium for the Beijing Tower. So Zaha Hadid used a sort of algorithmic AI CAD software to design a space that you wouldn't get to with a human, but it's them using AI as an interesting tool to challenge their sort of artistic approach. The middle one is an early example of generative adaptive networks is an AI technique where you kind of pit two separate AIs learning and competing against each other to kind of come up with interesting new approaches. And they taught it a whole range of different artistic styles. It basically learnt 80,000 different pieces of artwork and then started coming up with its own. And they did a study where they then tested those bits of art with real people, and often the AI art outperformed original art in terms of its originality and its interest. So I think, in terms of even pure sort of abstract art, you can see examples where AI has been able to produce stuff that's interesting, and actually you can't tell the difference between human-produced art. And so I think there's a really interesting thing there where it's pushing some interesting boundaries, it's planting some thoughts, and it's, as an artist, you can kind of take that and see where it takes you. And then last one is just, and there's been a bit of a theme of David Bowie references throughout the day, but David Bowie built this in the 90s. It's called Verbicizer. He was, and he was, very interested in going, how can technology help him be more creative? And so he created this little software. It's not AI in any sense. It's a random word generator that would spit up words at him. And those words he would use to found poetry and inspiration for lyrics. So my thinking is kind of, if it's good enough for David Bowie, it's good enough for us. If we're in the job of finding creative inspiration, then I think the right crafted sort of technology and tools can only help us do that better. And I know everyone talks a lot about the process with AI and AlphaGo. But what I found really interesting about it, and I think to what Tim was talking about of machines thinking inside the box, actually what you have here is an interesting example of the AI thinking outside the box. So this was Lee Sedol, who's the world's best player at Go, and he's in his second game, having lost the first game. And at move 37, you kind of see his mouth drop, and the machine plays a move that no human had really thought of. And the commentator goes, "Beautiful, just beautiful." So this idea that this move was totally different and totally unexpected, but on reflection was brilliant. And so and they've written whole articles and whole books about what that means for the world of Go playing, which is a big deal if you're into Go. And what was interesting was Lee Sedol in game 4 came back and he played a move that was inspired because he was trying to get into the mind of the machine. And he played a move that everyone, I think they called it the God move. So you have you have this interesting interplay where the machine plays something that challenges how everyone thinks the game should be played. And in response, Lee Sedol, and he comes on to win that game, the one of the 5 that he won. and it got him to play better as well. So I sort of think this is what my optimistic angle would be, is that humans and artificial intelligence working together should be the perfect creative partners. If in a good creative partner you're looking at someone that challenges your thinking and is designed to think in a different but complementary way, if you have you and the feedback loop with an AI, that should be the sort of thing that can happen. And we saw this with, so this was Fan Hui who helped train AlphaGo. And in that process, he went from being ranked 600th in the world to being ranked 300th in the world. So by working with the machine, you become better and the machine becomes better. And all of that, for me, was kind of a bit of a shift in how we see and talk about creativity in sort of agency land. From a time when you fetishize craft and graft, of the idea of, doing it the handwritten way, doing it the old-fashioned way is the right way, to going, actually, let's choose what we focus our time and effort on. Then there's a bit around going, we're not talking about our sort of our agency style or our real or our reputation. It's about how good our AI is, how good our technology and our tools are at helping us be creative and helping us be creative at scale. Do we move back to the centaur chess? Do we move from thinking about creative teams to thinking about centaur teams, where we've got people who have their own set of tools they know they're good at working with? And it kind of gets us away from going, we're selling billable creative hours, to what we're doing is we're selling kind of creativity as a service, and that's something we can deliver more consistently thanks to all of the stuff that we've done. So that was the theory. And I sort of wrote down, I was quite pleased with myself, as I often am. But then at the And-Partnership, and this I'll sort of talk through a little case study here, which I can't take all the credit for. It was mostly all done by other people in the team. But we've taken our first step to try and become creative cyborgs, and I can try and talk you through what we learned from the process. And it was on the Lexus ES brief, where they came in, and what they said, what initially sparked it, and I guess you'd kind of go, the idea of doing this in the first place was some of the creativity in it. Was that it's a car that has a lot of technology in it to make it intuitive. So it preempts what you want to do and is intuitive. So we thought, how about we try and make an ad that's as intuitive and it is human and machine working together to bring that to life. So there should be a little video of the background, and then I'll talk you through the process and I'll show you the end result. And I'll leave it up to you. It's not as laugh out loud funny as the Burger King example. And it's an interesting debate whether you think it's an example of good creativity or not, but we're kind of proud of where we ended up. It's better with sound, but...
Started the process of thinking, how could we...
Hang on, I'll start it again.
The car represents the new face of Lexus.
The ES has all sorts of technology which interact with the driver to aid the driver.
And that started the process of thinking, how could we make an advert that mirrored the man and machine element of the car itself?
It was felt that this would be a car that would be particularly appealing to intuitive individuals. We used a number of tools to extract every single bit of information we could from the last 15 years worth of award-winning adverts. We're looking at what's the relationship between people and the vehicles and the use of the cars, every attribute that could be drawn from them.
I think we all like to flatter ourselves. We have a unique way of understanding the world that no machine could ever replicate. Wouldn't it be great if we actually continued that notion and had an ad written by a computer? But I thought it'll never work in a million years. I mean, what nonsense.
So what we did was we started with, well, first we started with the idea of let's try and make an ad with an AI because it fits with the brief, not just because we should. But then we went, okay, well, let's start trying to build that. So we worked with some good partners, and what's kind of interesting nowadays is actually a lot of the heavy lifting sort of AI stuff is now something you can kind of tap into quite easily. So we built sort of a machine learning environment on AWS. We tapped into kind of Amazon's recognition software to do a lot of the tagging and the analysis, and we partnered with IBM Watson to provide sort of the AI power and expertise behind it. We're quite a small agency. We don't have an army of developers out there, so it was more partnering and pulling together the bits and pieces that made it happen. And as it sort of said in that we chose what are some interesting learning points we can try and feed into the machine and try and learn. And it was a little bit, just playing around and seeing what came out. So we thought, and the whole premise of this is we give it the data, it applies machine learning, and we see if we can get it to the point where it can write good, coherent scripts. So to start off with, we thought, well, let's try and feed it some good stuff. So we went through and gave it some award-winning stuff. So we just gave it as much sort of historic ad reels of creative campaign sort of award-winning ads. And we tried to do that as well. We decided if we just fed it car ads, we'd end up with something that looked like a car ad. So we didn't just feed it endless, cars on roads ads. We wanted to give it an interesting kind of a healthy diet of different types of ads. So we thought, actually, what are the sorts of things we want it to learn from? What are the themes we want it to pull out? So we went, automotive, but we also went luxury, we went craft, we went heritage. We went, let's put some interesting things into the mix. And it sort of tried to kind of keep it on brief, and it started kind of coming up with pulling together commonalities and saying what are sort of some features based on the sort of the algorithms and the inputs we'd given it that come across in each of them. And so it started saying, oh, well, there's this thing about bringing inanimate objects to life, and then there's this thing about displays of emotion. Although when we actually looked at the output it gave us for what it recommended on the script, it was pretty heavy-handed with emotion. It was like just slapping lots of emotion in it. So you can sort of see where it's good and where it doesn't really get what it's saying. So it was saying, displays of emotion are a big thing. It was saying, here are some of the emotional devices. Let's play with, let's do kid scenes. Let's do these sorts of scenes. But also it called out, it needs some tension. We need some bad guys. There's some conflicts. There's a bit of a tension there. It said there was a theme around lots of crashes and near misses, but where everyone's okay, which again makes sense. We probably didn't feed it lots of ads which had horrible car crashes in it, but it sort of had that kind of theme. And then some sort of unexpected things that it started saying as well. So sort of talking about aspects of fantasy coming out, and it kind of ended up as well with kind of car crash test facilities as well. And so we'd fed it all of these different elements, and we'd sort of tweaked a couple of the different sort of variables going into it. And then we started getting scripts back and sort of going, what was interesting. And I think, again, the important point here is if we'd shot just exactly what it had said, we'd have ended up with an ad a bit more like the Burger King ad. It's the human and the machine working together to interpret and develop the work that kind of gets it to an interesting place. And also what happened as well is what we did was we'd been making a documentary about the process with Kevin MacDonald, and he was so interested in it by this point he also wanted to direct the final film. So it's a human director but using inputs from an AI, and I think some of the kind of key things was that right at the start we got the client really on board and excited to make whatever it came up with. And so again, part of it was that it just meant that we didn't second guess ourselves. We didn't back down. We kind of went, actually, we're going to make pretty much what the AI tells us. And so we took all of those points. We did a bit of tweaking, a bit of crafting, and then ended up with a script that we shot. And so I'll play you the end output now. And so, and I mean, I imagine it might come up in the questions at the end whether people think that's a good ad or not is an interesting debate, and also whether it's an AI written ad or not is it's one where it's a cyborg written ad. It's us and the machine working together that got to it. What I can say is that we wouldn't have ended up with that ad if we'd not taken this approach. And I think there is something interesting that some of the weirder and unusual ideas in there came from a brain that doesn't think like us, and that for me is quite cool and quite interesting. And we haven't suddenly gone, right, this is great, every new ad's going through this machine and like it's cracked it. It was a really interesting experiment for us, and I think we learned a lot about what's good and what's bad from a kind of creative point of view. A couple of things we learned, and it was a real learning experience. Was a lot of the time you'd get the creators at the start saying, "So once we've turned the AI on, can it just write us ads?" Or there's that sort of sense that it's once you get it working, it's this magic box. Like, what does the AI tell us to do now? And it doesn't work like that. It's it's a tool, and it's something that we tinkered with to make it do this specific task. It's not inherently better. Could we have written a different ad that was more emotively moving using humans? Probably, but that wasn't entirely the point. But we also learned it's actually relatively accessible. We didn't need to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds in R&D. We didn't need to spend 12 months with AI experts. A lot of it could be done with relatively sort of off-the-shelf stuff and just putting it together in an interesting way and partnering in the right way. And overall, what we kind of learned was it can get you to unexpected places. I think we're all glad we did it and found it very interesting. And I think and I'll talk a little bit about some of the existential questions you have off the back of it. The creatives have all found it an interesting experience having a fundamentally different creative partner to work with. And actually, if you see it just as a toolkit, it's more tools in the toolkit for us to work with. That's probably a more helpful way of thinking about it, rather than being this sort of magical AI will solve everything. And you go, well, actually, no. It's a really interesting set of tools that can do a bunch of things that are just about coming to the point where they really work. And so here's just some of the sorts of things they can do, and I'm sure you've all seen, the deep fakes stuff, but the deep fakes are often done with kind of a PR spin. But actually, it just means you can do really interesting, convincing image and video generation. And so you can produce voice, video, and so for things like localizing ads and for things like getting the most out of celebrity partnerships, you can do really interesting stuff with that. It can learn to replicate different styles. So, in my mind, I like the idea that, instead of paying for a specific track, you license that artist's AI music bot, and that can provide you a track that sounds like, it's often the brief for a music search anyway. But now you could quite easily go, I want music that sounds like Fortet, and you could license that from an AI. So kind of interesting how this could all play out. Auto tagging, searching, learning in the more kind of MarTech world, you've got that whole piece of going, actually, we can make more out of our assets once we've made them. So being able to properly manage all of our assets, know where they are, know what we're doing with them, and measure what works and what doesn't. We're not too far from everything joining up enough that we can do some really interesting stuff there. And then I think, AI-generated sort of CAD design problem solving and AI-generated sort of copy, they're all, quite a lot of them are in the sort of art experiment end of the spectrum at the moment, but I think all of that should be creative inspiration for people working in the creative industries. And I think rather than pointing at it and going, that's not as good as a human could do it, I think it's looking at it and going, that's actually kind of interesting, that can help me in the creative process. So for me, I think that's one of the really interesting kind of points that we've kind of got to kind of what's in this toolkit and what's it change about how we operate. But the last bit I was going to talk about a little bit was the importance of making sure, and the way that it's always been positioned is that it is looking at humanity in the machine and looking at the ethical and human implications of using AI to make more and more marketing decisions. And when you look at some of the ways that it's being used, I think it's important to have these questions sort of now rather than when it's too late. And so the ethics behind using AI to do all of these little things is quite interesting. Not because I think there's anything inherently unethical about the Lexus ad I just showed you, and not because there's some terrifying robot apocalypse on the corner. But actually, it's because all of those little algorithmic nudges, so lots of little marketing and business decisions that are being made by sort of machine learning platforms, all add up. You know, Netflix can determine whether I become more open-minded or more closed-minded, or what it recommends can make me happy or sad. You know, what the Amazon Fresh algorithm can decide whether I make healthy choices or unhealthy choices. And so I think all of these little nudges and these little sort of things that we're trusting algorithms to do, you know, if they're deciding whether the background of this ad should be red or blue, whether it should use this copy or that copy, all of those little nudges add up over time, and I think are really important. And I think this is something that, you know, again, touched on with some of the talks earlier today, of kind of going, as you have non-human actors kind of making creative choices, you've got to start talking about who's the agency behind it? So who's the person, the author, who's kind of responsible ultimately as well? Then there's also, you know, what's the intent behind what we're doing? You know, what did we actually want to use it for? Are we using AI to try and manipulate people and make them choose things they don't want to do? What are we trying to do with it? And then what's the outcome as well? So kind of what goes into the machine, what comes out of the machine, and who's responsible for the machine? They're kind of like the three components that I think, if we're going to use this more and more broadly, become really important. And I think there is, you know, there's kind of like a series of things that can go wrong, and you can kind of see examples of this already. So there's in the sort of, you know, when the system's sort of working as intended, but you have a bad outcome, you get kind of unconscious bias, and you can see this in, you know, they've done an interesting thing where they've taught it's a system that can spot the early signs of Alzheimer's, and they've developed it, but it works incredibly accurately. It works like 95% accuracy if you have a French-Canadian accent. And there's a whole interesting, if you end up with unconscious bias, because an awful lot of the data sets and the learning sets have their own bias in them. So the learning set we use for the Lexus ad will have bias put into it that we then, you know, need to be conscious of. In terms of sort of the unfair advantage, there's this whole, you know, if we're using algorithms to manipulate people more and more, we need to understand, you know, if one company has it and another doesn't, does that give them an unfair advantage? And is it fair on consumers to be using huge data sets to influence their decisions about their knowledge? There's obviously, you know, the unethical usage is the, you know, actually setting out to use them for bad. But I think there's also the sort of the unintended consequences. So I think, again, you see stuff with a lot of the tensions you've had around Facebook recently is the unintended consequences of optimizing things for time spent on platform. And we've ended up in a situation where it's not necessarily how we wanted it to be. No one set out to create some of the challenges we've got today. And for me, there's an interesting tipping point where you know, things done by a human, advertising done by a human can be persuasive or you know, seducing and persuading people. But when it's being done by a machine, it can be seen as manipulation. And I think there's an interesting point there where it's what's that sort of that shift that means people suddenly feel uncomfortable with it. And there's this interesting kind of, there's a thought experiment around if you have a painting that you love and you bought it, you put it on your wall, you look at it every day, you paid 5,000 euros for it, and it's your favorite painting, and then 5 years later you discover it was a forgery all along. Does that change how you feel about that artwork? Does it change your relationship with that painting? And I think we have a similar kind of interesting tension now. Does anyone know this? So this is I think it's the first major piece of AI-generated artwork that sold, which it sold for actually $432,000, which is quite interesting. And then before I did this talk, YouGov offered to do a survey just out of interest to help kind of with the talk. And so I thought this would be quite an interesting thing to test. So we did a survey where we showed people this, and in one of them we told them it was made by an AI, another one we didn't, so they thought it was done by a human. And people were 50% more likely to find it visually appealing if they thought it was done by a human than done by an AI. So there's something interesting in that there's a sort of inherent human rejection of this idea that we're being exposed to creative made by a machine. So you know, this is one that we did. I did it just for this, but it's quite an interesting. You know, I quite like that idea that why is it that humans put that preciousness on knowing it's been done by a human and not done by a machine? And similarly, if more and more ads are being made or tweaked by automation, by AI, should people care? Will people care? And will we all feel like Gary Kasparov with this kind of existential angst of, I've poured my life and soul into working in creative agencies, and now we've got a whole bunch of bots doing it for us. And it's quite an interesting one, again, of going, why do we feel, particularly with creative endeavors, that it particularly galls us when computers can do it better? And so one of the other things I asked in the same survey was, we asked, what would you trust an AI to do? And so he said, do your taxes, write a novel, and writing advertising. And so I thought this was, again, quite interesting, kind of put up about, so 64% are very happy trusting an AI to do your taxes, which seems sort of fair enough. And only 35% were happy. I thought that was higher than I expected, to be honest. 35% were happy with an AI writing them a novel. And I was sort of thinking, where would advertising come in the spectrum? And it sits sort of in the middle. So actually people kind of care so little, they don't really mind if they end up having an AI write it for us. But there's this interesting point of kind of going, what does it do around that shift from persuasion to manipulation, and that sort of that narrative around trust in advertising? And so, to start to wrap up, I think all of this starts to ask some quite difficult questions around, as we use this more and more, and as it's a tool that can, in theory, make us into interesting, creative superheroes, it does also open up a whole bunch of interesting, difficult ethical questions that we need to kind of keep asking. So, is it something we should be doing? Something we should be doing more of? And what should we, what should we be conscious of in that whole process? And then, so, if we had the kind of be more Bowie earlier, I also have the be more Iron Man as my other point. If there's kind of like, if that's the way we see it, is it's kind of going, how can we use technology to uniquely complement and make us better at what we are? And if we do it with the right ethical framework in mind, it can only be a good thing. And I think it's a sort of human stubbornness to insist that actually we can't be improved by AI. We've been improved by technology over hundreds, thousands of years, and this is just the next step of it. But it also means we don't want to just walk into it blindly and see where it takes us. So be more Iron Man. And that's that.